The world around Judah was a storm, and they were caught right at its heart. It was the end of the 7th century BC, and this small nation faced forces beyond its control. On one side, the powerful Egyptian empire sought to assert its dominance. On the other, the unstoppable rise of Babylon threatened to devour the nations in its path. The political stage was a whirlwind of shifting alliances, betrayals, and ambitions. Judah's kings, grappling for survival, would find themselves making costly decisions, binding themselves to powers they could not tame. But beneath the surface, another, deeper crisis was growing. Judah was drifting away from its roots, from the covenant they had made with God. Once, they had been a people set apart, called to honor and uphold the commandments given to their ancestors. Now, the land was filled with idols, pagan altars, and rituals that turned them further and further from their heritage. The people's hearts grew cold, lost in the allure of prosperity and power, blinded to the spiritual decay that seeped into every corner of their society. Into this darkness, God sent Jeremiah, a man who would stand as a beacon of truth, even when it cost him everything. He was young, untested, and wholly unprepared for the weight that would be placed on his shoulders. But he was chosen, a prophet set apart to carry a message that Judah desperately needed to hear, though it would wound as much as it would heal. Jeremiah's arrival wasn't an accident. It was a call to wake a nation slumbering on the edge of disaster. His voice was meant to cut through the noise of false promises and empty words, to pierce the hearts of kings and commoners alike. He wasn't there to comfort. He was there to confront, to pull back the veil on Judah's sins, and to sound the alarm. In a time when people wanted reassurance, Jeremiah brought urgency. He was called to be a watchman, and he saw the sword coming. But would anyone listen? The stage was set. Jeremiah's message of repentance was to be Judah's last chance, a final plea to turn back before it was too late. But the people resisted, clinging to illusions of security and refusing to see the storm on the horizon. False prophets told them all was well, whispering of peace when none was coming. Jeremiah's task was formidable: to pull his nation out of its spiritual stupor and bring them face to face with their broken covenant. Yet this wasn't just a national crisis, it was personal for Jeremiah. He didn't stand detached from his message. His love for Judah ran deep, his heart breaking with each warning that went unheard. The anguish he felt wasn't merely prophetic, it was human. He was a man called to bear a burden so heavy that it would break lesser spirits. He would stand against kings, endure scorn from his people, and wrestle with doubt in his quiet moments. Still, he would speak because he knew the gravity of what lay ahead. Judah's political alliances might have brought a sense of safety, but Jeremiah knew better. He saw the judgment looming, a reckoning that would come regardless of the treaties signed or armies raised. His voice was the last whisper of mercy, a chance for Judah to turn away from destruction and toward a God who was still willing to forgive. In this story, Jeremiah becomes more than just a prophet. He is a man on the edge, carrying the weight of his people's fate in his words. He knew the stakes. He understood the cost. And still, he stepped forward, delivering a message that would ultimately be his cross to bear. The story of Jeremiah's calling begins long before he ever walked the earth. In a quiet, unassuming town called Anathoth, a young man was about to discover a destiny woven into the fabric of his being from the moment of his conception. He was just a youth, uncertain, not yet shaped by the harshness of life or the burden of responsibility. Yet God had a plan that would alter the course of his life, and indeed, the life of his nation. One day, God spoke to Jeremiah with words that would forever change him. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." These words were not a gentle calling. They were a summons, a declaration of a purpose beyond anything Jeremiah could have imagined. God hadn't just noticed him on a whim. He had crafted Jeremiah's life with precision, with intention. And now it was time to step into that purpose. But Jeremiah was not ready. How could he be? He was young, likely in his teens, a man with hopes and dreams like anyone else. Dreams that didn't include bearing the weight of a nation's sins on his shoulders. Jeremiah trembled, not with excitement, but with fear. "Alas, sovereign Lord," he replied, "I do not know how to speak. I am too young." His words were laced with hesitation, a plea for release from this daunting assignment. He was just a boy, after all, untrained, unworthy, and unprepared. How could he be the voice of God's judgment and mercy? But God's response was firm, unwavering. "Do not say, 'I am too young.' You must go to everyone I send you to and say, 'Whatever I command you.' Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you." God's words were like a gentle but unbreakable chain binding Jeremiah to his destiny. Age, ability, fear, none of these would stand in the way of what God had purposed. Jeremiah's excuses fell away as God's promise filled the gaps in his courage. He would not walk this path alone. Then, in a profound moment, God reached out and touched Jeremiah's mouth, saying, "I have put my words in your mouth." This touch was more than symbolic. It was an infusion of divine authority, a transfer of heavenly power into the frailty of human lips. From that moment on, Jeremiah's voice would no longer be his own. He would speak the words of the Almighty, proclaiming truth to a nation that had wandered far from its purpose. But this truth would often be bitter, a message that would bring him more suffering than honor. As Jeremiah absorbed this calling, he knew there was no turning back. Every plan he had, every dream he'd held was now overshadowed by this higher purpose. He was called not to comfort, but to confront, not to bring peace, but to bring urgency. This was the kind of mission that demanded everything. A prophet's life was one of sacrifice, isolation, and often heartbreak. And Jeremiah knew that this calling would set him apart, not in glory, but in suffering. Yet, in his hesitations we see ourselves. How often do we feel inadequate, unworthy of the purpose laid before us? Jeremiah's story tells us that God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. It was not Jeremiah's strength, but his willingness to yield to something greater, to accept a destiny crafted by the Creator himself, that would make him the prophet he was meant to be. And though the path would be filled with anguish, he would walk it, knowing that it was God's strength, not his own, that would sustain him. From that day on, Jeremiah was no longer just a young man from Anathoth. He was a prophet to the nations, a voice that would speak to the rise and fall of kingdoms, to the hearts of kings and peasants alike. He was chosen, set apart, a vessel for a divine message that could not be silenced. He understood that his life was not his own, that his mission was not about glory, but about obedience, not about comfort, but about courage. As we step into Jeremiah's journey, we are reminded that sometimes destiny finds us in the most unexpected ways. We may feel unready, even unwilling, but like Jeremiah, we must be willing to answer the call, to step into the purpose laid before us, trusting that the one who calls us will also equip us. As Jeremiah began to walk the path of his prophetic calling, the weight of his burden became undeniable. He was tasked with delivering a message of judgment, one that no one wanted to hear. The people of Judah had grown accustomed to their lives, to their routines, to the comfort of their idols and false assurances. They did not want their comfort disturbed, and they certainly did not want it disturbed by a young prophet from Anathoth, crying out warnings that felt too dark, too severe, and altogether too real. Everywhere Jeremiah turned, he was met with rejection. His warnings fell on deaf ears, and his cries were silenced by the laughter of scoffers. Other prophets, ones who spoke of peace and prosperity, were welcomed with open arms. They brought comfort to the people, reassuring them that all would be well, that God would protect them regardless of their actions. But Jeremiah's words were different. His message was one of repentance, of returning to God with sincere hearts, and the people saw it as a threat to their way of life. Loneliness became Jeremiah's constant companion. He watched as friends turned away, family members grew distant, and the people he loved most shunned him. The ache of solitude weighed on him, but he carried on, knowing he could not abandon his calling, even though it was tearing him apart. His heart was bound to the fate of Judah. He loved his people deeply, and he grieved over their stubbornness, over their refusal to heed the warning that could save them. Yet, in their eyes, he was a nuisance, a prophet of doom, someone to be ignored or despised. Jeremiah found himself standing alone against the tide of his nation's rebellion. He was like a lone tree in a vast, barren landscape, rooted yet battered by unending storms. His message was clear and uncompromising, but it cost him everything. Those he once called friends now viewed him as an enemy. Even the priests and religious leaders, the very people who should have stood with him, dismissed his words. He became a man set apart, isolated not just by his calling, but by the hardness of people's hearts. In his moments of deepest despair, Jeremiah poured out his pain to God. His prayers, recorded in the scriptures, reveal the turmoil within him. He was honest with God about his struggles, about the anguish of his loneliness and the bitterness of rejection. He even reached a point where he cursed the day he was born, wishing he had never come into the world to bear such a heavy burden. This was no ordinary prophet. Jeremiah's heart was as fragile as it was passionate, and he laid bare his soul before God, unafraid to show his pain. Despite the sorrow, despite the nights spent weeping for a people who would not listen, Jeremiah never abandoned his mission. He held fast to his calling, even when it seemed as though it might break him. This unyielding faith, this resilience in the face of constant rejection, made Jeremiah a unique figure in the history of Israel's prophets. He didn't just preach, he lived his message, embodying the sorrow and heartbreak that comes when a people turn away from God. The false prophets, on the other hand, enjoyed popularity. They promised peace, prosperity, and security, feeding the people words they longed to hear. They painted a picture of a future that was safe, ignoring the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The people clung to these false promises, preferring the comfortable lie over the painful truth. But Jeremiah could not bring himself to lie to his people, no matter how much it isolated him. His love for Judah drove him to speak the truth, even when it came at the cost of his own happiness, his own sense of belonging. In one of his most heartfelt laments, Jeremiah is heard saying, "Oh, that my head were waters, and my eyes a fountain of tears, that I might weep day and night for the slain of the daughter of my people." His grief was not for himself, but for Judah, for the people he knew were headed toward destruction. He was a prophet whose heart broke every day, yet he found the strength to continue because he believed in the importance of his message. His suffering was not in vain. He knew he was called to be a voice in the wilderness, even if that voice went unheeded. Through Jeremiah's loneliness and rejection, we see the cost of speaking truth in a world that clings to comfort. His life serves as a reminder that faithfulness to a higher calling often requires sacrifice, and that the path of righteousness is not always lined with acceptance or applause. Jeremiah shows us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward in spite of it. His love for Judah drove him to endure the pain, to keep speaking, to keep weeping, to keep hoping, even when all seemed lost. In his story, we find the courage to face our own moments of isolation and rejection. We are reminded that sometimes standing for truth means standing alone, and that our calling may not always be understood by those around us. But like Jeremiah, we are called to be faithful, to carry out our mission with unwavering dedication, knowing that our obedience is not in vain. Jeremiah's loneliness was the price he paid to remain true to his purpose, and in his endurance, we find inspiration to face the challenges of our own journey. As Jeremiah continued to deliver his message of repentance and impending judgment, the opposition he faced grew fiercer, more personal, and far more dangerous. It wasn't just the people in the streets who rejected him. Now the leaders, those with power and authority, were determined to silence him. The very priests and prophets, the spiritual leaders of Judah, became some of his harshest opponents. And among them, a powerful priest named Pashur would play a dark role in Jeremiah's story. Pashur was no stranger to authority. He held influence, not just over the religious practices of the people, but also over the atmosphere in the temple courts. He was a man who could shape opinions, steer decisions, and protect the temple's reputation. And when Jeremiah's words began to unsettle the people, to stir doubt and fear, Pashur decided that he had heard enough. In his eyes, Jeremiah wasn't just a nuisance. He was a threat, a voice of discord in a time when unity was fragile. One day, after hearing yet another of Jeremiah's warnings, Pashur snapped. He ordered that Jeremiah be seized, arrested on charges of disturbing the peace and spreading despair among the people. But this wasn't an ordinary imprisonment. Pashur wanted to send a message, not just to Jeremiah, but to anyone who dared to challenge the comfortable deceptions that Judah's leaders clung to. So, he had Jeremiah beaten, a cruel and painful punishment intended to break his spirit and humiliate him in the eyes of the people. Then, as if the beating wasn't enough, Pashur ordered Jeremiah to be placed in the stocks. The stocks were a device designed not only to restrain but to torture. They held the prisoner's body in an unnatural position, causing excruciating pain in the muscles and joints. Jeremiah was left there on public display for everyone to see, a warning to others who might think of echoing his words. He endured the agony hour after hour, exposed to the elements and the mocking jeers of passers-by. The night must have felt endless. Jeremiah's body was racked with pain, his spirit likely wavering under the weight of humiliation and exhaustion. Here was a man called to speak truth, yet despised and punished for doing exactly that. In this moment of intense suffering, it would have been easy to question his calling, to wonder if it was worth it, if maybe he had misheard God or misunderstood his mission. But despite his pain, despite the silence of the night and the echoes of his own doubts, Jeremiah remained resolute. He was driven not by human approval, but by a conviction that ran deeper than any earthly suffering. The next day, Pashur released Jeremiah, expecting him to be broken, subdued, perhaps even repentant for his words. But Jeremiah was far from defeated. Bruised and battered, he stood before Pashur with the strength of a man who had faced the worst of human cruelty and come out on the other side unshaken. In a stunning display of courage, Jeremiah looked Pashur in the eyes and delivered yet another prophecy, this one directed specifically at his tormentor. He told Pashur that God had renamed him Terror on Every Side, a name that foreshadowed the fear and disaster that would soon come upon him and all of Judah. Jeremiah warned that Pashur, along with his friends and followers, would fall by the sword of Babylon, and that they would be carried into exile, never to see their homeland again. It was a chilling prophecy, one that cut through the pride and cruelty of Pashur's heart, leaving him with a glimpse of the fate that awaited him. Jeremiah's resilience in the face of such suffering is a testament to the strength that comes from unwavering faith. He could have given in, he could have softened his words, he could have turned away from his mission to avoid the pain and persecution. But he didn't. He stood firm, refusing to be silenced, even when it meant enduring physical and emotional torment. His strength was not his own. It was the power of his calling, the conviction that he was speaking the words of God, words that needed to be heard, no matter the cost. This episode with Pashur marked a turning point in Jeremiah's life as a prophet. He now understood that his mission would not just be difficult, it would be dangerous. The path he was on was one that would lead to greater suffering, to more rejection, to further isolation. Yet he chose to continue, knowing that he had been set apart for this very purpose. His suffering was not in vain. It was a part of his calling, a price he willingly paid to remain true to the God who had called him from the womb. Through Jeremiah's story, We see the strength that comes from a life dedicated to truth, even when that truth is met with hostility. His courage reminds us that sometimes speaking out for what is right requires enduring the scorn and rejection of those who would prefer comfort over conviction. Jeremiah's willingness to suffer for his mission challenges us to consider what we are willing to endure for our own beliefs, for the values we hold dear. In our world today, where compromise is often easier than conviction, Jeremiah stands as a powerful example of resilience. His story invites us to reflect on our own willingness to stand firm in the face of opposition, to speak truth even when it costs us, and to hold to our purpose even when the path is painful. Jeremiah's imprisonment was not just a moment of suffering. It was a testament to his faith, a demonstration of a heart that would not be moved by fear or hatred. For those who watched him suffer in the stocks, he may have appeared weak, broken, and defeated. But in reality, he was stronger than ever, forged in the fires of adversity, refined by the trials that tested his resolve. Jeremiah's strength was not found in the absence of pain, but in his willingness to endure it for the sake of a higher calling. In the aftermath of his imprisonment and torture, Jeremiah faced a moment of profound inner conflict. He had devoted his life to a mission that seemed to yield nothing but rejection and suffering. Despite his warnings, the people continued to ignore his pleas, clinging to their ways and trusting in false assurances. The burden of carrying such a heavy message with so little response weighed on him deeply. Yet, even as doubt and despair crept into his soul, Jeremiah found a source of resilience that sustained him through the darkest moments. Jeremiah's faith was not untouched by hardship. It was strengthened and shaped by it. In one of his most candid prayers, he confesses to God, "You deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me." His words reveal the raw struggle he faced, the bitterness of feeling like a lone voice crying out into an unhearing void. He felt as if he'd been trapped in a role he hadn't chosen, bound by a calling that brought him nothing but pain. Yet, even as he wrestled with these thoughts, he found himself unable to walk away. In his moments of despair, Jeremiah tried to silence himself, to push the words back and abandon his prophetic mission. But he found that he couldn't. "But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot." His heart burned with an unquenchable fire, a fire that compelled him to speak, even when silence would have spared him. This fire was not one of anger or bitterness. It was the unyielding presence of God's purpose within him. Jeremiah's resilience was born of this fire, this divine purpose that lived within him. He understood that his life was meant for something greater than comfort or acceptance. Even in the face of overwhelming rejection, he held fast to his faith, finding strength not in the approval of others, but in his unwavering dedication to the truth. This was a faith that went beyond mere belief. It was an anchor that held him steady when everything around him was falling apart. Despite the constant hardships, Jeremiah's love for his people never waned. His heart ached for Judah, for the people who refused to listen, for the children who would suffer because of the sins of their parents. He carried this burden with a profound sense of empathy, feeling the weight of their choices and grieving over the suffering he knew was coming. In his faith, he found the strength to keep going, to continue speaking, to keep hoping, even when every outward sign pointed to failure. Jeremiah's resilience is a reminder that true faith doesn't shield us from hardship. It sustains us through it. His story shows us that resilience isn't about avoiding pain, but enduring it for the sake of something greater. Jeremiah didn't just survive his trials, he grew stronger through them, his heart and spirit refined by every struggle he faced. His life became a testament to the power of faith in the face of despair, a living example of a man who would not give up, no matter how dark the path became. When we look at Jeremiah's story, we see the beauty of a faith that is unbreakable, a commitment that goes beyond convenience or comfort. Jeremiah teaches us that resilience is found in holding onto what we know is true, even when it costs us everything. His journey reminds us that our worth is not measured by how others receive us, but by our faithfulness to the calling placed on our lives. Jeremiah's resilience was not without moments of doubt or pain, but it was unwavering in its purpose. He faced each trial with a strength that defied explanation, a resolve that could only come from a life grounded in the assurance of his calling. And as he stood firm, he showed the world that true strength is found not in the absence of struggle, but in the courage to continue despite it. In his story, we find a call to resilience, a challenge to hold fast to our own faith in the face of hardship. Jeremiah's life invites us to embrace the fire within us, to let it burn away our fears and doubts, to stand firm in the knowledge that our struggles are not without purpose. His resilience was a light that shone in the darkness, a beacon for those who would follow, and an example that echoes through the ages. Though Jeremiah's message was often one of warning and impending judgment, it wasn't devoid of hope. Amidst the darkness of his prophecies, there were glimmers of a future restoration, promises that went beyond judgment to speak of renewal and reconciliation. For Jeremiah, these prophecies of hope were a light, not just for himself, but for his people, a reminder that God's ultimate desire was not to destroy, but to restore. This message of hope, like a breath of fresh air, became a source of strength, both for Jeremiah and for the remnant who clung to faith in God's promises. One of the most profound promises God gave through Jeremiah was the vision of a new covenant, one that would change the very nature of humanity's relationship with God. Unlike the covenant written on tablets of stone, this new covenant would be written on the hearts of the people. God spoke through Jeremiah, saying, "I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." This was a promise of transformation, a covenant that went beyond obedience to a deep, personal relationship with God. Jeremiah's words painted a picture of a people no longer bound by external laws alone, but driven by a genuine desire to walk in righteousness. This new heart would be one that sought after God willingly, a heart that understood the joy of living in harmony with His will. This promise of inner renewal struck at the core of what Jeremiah's mission was truly about, calling the people back to a heart-level devotion to God, to a love that would transcend the cycles of rebellion and repentance that had defined their history. But these prophecies of hope didn't just speak to individual transformation. They also painted a picture of national and communal restoration. Jeremiah foresaw a day when Judah and Israel, once divided and weakened, would be reunited. He spoke of a future where they would return to their land, where the exiled would come home, and the ruins would be rebuilt. This was a vision that seemed impossible in the present reality, but Jeremiah's words carried the power of divine assurance. God was not finished with His people, and though they would face destruction and exile, He promised to gather them again, to bring them back to the place where they belonged. In his prophecies, Jeremiah offered hope to those who felt lost, to those who wondered if they had gone too far, if they were beyond redemption. He reminded them that God's love was relentless, that even in their darkest hour, His desire was to bring them back, to heal what was broken and restore what had been lost. The people may have strayed, but God's covenant with them was unbreakable, and His mercy inexhaustible. This message of a new heart and a restored nation was a beacon for those who struggled to see a future amid the ruins of their present. Jeremiah's message of hope was not without its conditions. This restoration, this promise of a new heart, required repentance. The people had to turn back to God, to forsake their idols, and to seek His face with sincerity. But the beauty of this promise lay in the fact that God was willing to empower them to change. He wasn't just calling them to an impossible standard. He was offering them the means to meet it, a heart that would naturally desire to do His will. This wasn't about outward conformity, It was about inner transformation, about becoming a people who lived from a place of authentic relationship with God. Jeremiah's vision of hope culminated in the promise of a righteous branch, a king who would reign wisely and do what is just and right. This branch, which Christians later understand as a prophecy pointing to the coming of Jesus, represented the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to redeem his people. Through this future leader, the justice and peace that Jeremiah longed for would finally come to pass. The people of Judah, weary from war, betrayal, and exile, would one day find rest in the presence of a king who would shepherd them with compassion and integrity. For Jeremiah, these glimpses of future restoration were more than words. They were lifelines that sustained him as he faced the harshness of his mission. His heart, weary from years of rejection and sorrow, found strength in the knowledge that God's ultimate plan was one of love and mercy. Though he often wept for his people, he knew that their story would not end in despair. His faith in this promised future gave him the resilience to continue, to endure the suffering of the present for the sake of the hope yet to come. This message of a new heart, a new covenant, and a new beginning speaks to us even today. It reminds us that no matter how far we have fallen or how broken we feel, there is always a path to restoration. God's desire is not to condemn, but to heal, to renew, to transform. And like Jeremiah, we are invited to hold on to this hope, to let it be the anchor that keeps us steady in times of trial, and to allow it to inspire us to live in a way that reflects God's love. Jeremiah's prophecies of hope were not just for the people of his time. They echo through the ages as a reminder that God's love is unchanging and his promises are forever. They challenge us to seek a relationship with him that goes beyond duty, that reaches into the deepest parts of our being, transforming us from the inside out. This hope calls us to be people of integrity, compassion, and faith, to be a light in a world that often feels dark and uncertain. In Jeremiah's message of hope, we see the heart of a God who never gives up on his people, a God who calls us to a future filled with his presence, his peace, and his unbreakable love. It is a promise that stands, a beacon that invites us to turn back to him, to trust in his mercy, and to believe in the power of a new beginning. As Jeremiah's life and mission drew to a close, his impact was only beginning. Though he lived in a time of despair, rejection, and exile, the legacy he left behind would inspire countless generations. Jeremiah's life serves as a testament to the power of unwavering faith, of courage in the face of overwhelming adversity, and of a heart devoted to truth, even when that truth is painful to deliver. His story is a reminder that our lives are often defined not by how others receive us, but by our commitment to the purpose we are called to fulfill. Jeremiah didn't live to see the full restoration he prophesied, but his words endured. His message, once ignored and despised, became a source of strength and hope for those who later found themselves in exile. The people of Judah, now far from their homeland, found solace in his prophecies of a new covenant, a new heart, and a restored relationship with God. His writings became sacred, preserved as a beacon for those who would seek hope in dark times. Jeremiah's voice continued to speak, offering comfort to the exiled, reminding them that their God had not abandoned them. Beyond his own nation, Jeremiah's story has inspired people throughout history who faced their own struggles, people who needed a reminder that faithfulness often requires endurance, and that true strength is found in obedience to a higher calling. In his life, we see that a single person's commitment to truth can echo through time, touching lives long after they are gone. Jeremiah's willingness to stand alone for what he believed in is a call to all who feel isolated in their convictions, to all who bear the burden of speaking truth in a world that prefers comfortable lies. Jeremiah's legacy is also a lesson in resilience. He shows us that it is possible to endure hardship without losing hope, to suffer rejection without losing faith, and to carry a burden without being crushed by it. His life is a model of spiritual fortitude, of finding strength not in human validation, but in divine purpose. Jeremiah's example challenges us to look beyond our immediate circumstances, to see the bigger picture, and to remember that our lives can have a purpose that goes beyond our understanding. His story reminds us that every act of faith, every moment of endurance, and every word of truth can have an impact that transcends time. Today, Jeremiah's words continue to resonate with those who feel called to speak truth, who feel the weight of a mission that seems too heavy to bear. His life encourages us to trust in the strength that comes from God, to press on even when the path is lonely, and to remember that we are part of a greater story. His legacy reminds us that our struggles are not meaningless, and that the seeds we plant in faith can bear fruit for generations to come. Jeremiah's life, though marked by suffering, was ultimately a life of victory. His victory wasn't in the acceptance he received or the comfort he enjoyed, but in his unwavering dedication to his calling. He remained faithful to the end, and through his endurance, he left a legacy that continues to inspire. Jeremiah's story calls each of us to find that same resilience, to hold fast to our values, and to walk in faith, knowing that our lives can serve a purpose beyond our own time. In honoring Jeremiah's legacy, we are reminded that courage, faith, and resilience are timeless virtues, and that each of us has the potential to make an impact that will last far beyond our years. His story is a testament to the transformative power of faithfulness, an invitation to live with purpose, and an encouragement to hold onto hope, even in the darkest moments. Through Jeremiah, we learn that true strength is found not in the absence of struggle, but in the willingness to endure it for the sake of something greater.